All right, so our last guest, Riccardo M. He's a PhD researcher at TU Vienna, and he's almost done with his PhD, and hopefully, well, very. I'm saying that we're gonna keep working. But I'm really happy that you're here, really, and I look forward to your talk. It's, yeah, I look forward to asking you a lot of questions. Thank you.
Yeah, great. I'm also very happy to be here, actually. I was a bit like caught off guard when Carla called me for this conference. First of all, because I kind of, yeah, I mean, these topics like AI, augmented reality, VR are something that I was somehow familiar with, especially because of the collaboration with our sister chair in Zurich, where also Carla somehow comes from. But I never really addressed this topic directly in my work. But nevertheless, I wanted still to I still accepted to come here for at least like some reasons. First of all, the first one I would say is because I haven't been in Orlando since I was 8 years old, so it was a good way to come back. But also I was very eager to see what you are allowed to present, and I was very happy to be here and also to learn from things that are quite, let's say, in a way, could be far from my interest, but actually then it's always very interesting for me to make bridges towards them, because then the core, I think, on the abstract level, they can be quite close, actually. Yeah, and then also kind of to have some kind of challenge, which was, let's try and speak about orthodox icons in a convention, in a conference about AI. Let's see if we can do it. So first of all, I would like to start off somehow how I kind of got the reception of the let's say of the brief of the conference. So the idea of playing models for me, what evokes is this idea of models in relationship to instruments and not as much as to tools. So of course, the idea of instruments as something that can be played, and therefore somehow a questioning of what I would say, what I would call a pragmatic or programmatic paradigm, so one that goes with efficiency optimization systems, as it was written in the description of it. And in this regard, for me, a helpful distinction is the one that was already proposed by Ludger in some time ago, which was one, here he was referring to programming languages, but I think we can extend this, I can call it a paradigm, so the one between deliberative and imperative paradigm. So the deliberative one for me connects with, of course, the idea of freedom, so that's what it's somehow implied in the idea of deliberative, but it's also sort of freedom as a liberation from, but also is somehow also a kind of political idea. So the liberation is a communal or a political resolution, a political decision. And imperative, of course, is linked to a more kind of commanding paradigm. And what I understand today is that there is somehow a dominance, especially in a kind of epistemological way, of the imperative, that makes the deliberative paradigm somehow today lost or hidden or invisible. In this sense, I would say to borrow from the presentation of Nicola and of Jorge, I would say that today Narcissus hides the form of Aphrodite in his mirror. And this is somehow how I can find resonance with my work. So for me, the invisible character, so the deliberative one, is the one embodied in what I would call the image. In my doctoral thesis that, if everything goes well, I will defend on the 18th of July. There is a quest for the image as something which is today lost, invisible, transparent, precisely like this deliberative character that underlies an understanding of models in terms of instrumentality and not of utility. But then why the image? Because of course the images can be, how can an image be something lost, hidden, or invisible, since the image is actually the visible par excellence in some way. This somehow I would like to introduce to you through this quote of Hans Blumenberg from his lecture he did in 1961, which is called Weltbilder und Weltmodelle, so world models and world pictures, where he presents this distinction between world model and world image, and it's by saying that in modernity, where we pass is like we pass from world images to world models. So the world model is kind of replacing what once was the word image, and whereas the word model is related to something about it's about accounts and statements, so it's, let's say, more linked to an imperative part in the description I was proposing before. Word image is more about orientation. So what I liked about word image, so I was thinking about how we could recover the image also, is the idea of image as something which is linked to orientation, but also is linked most of all to, so because Blumenberg speaks of world models in relation to the fact that in a world model, man is a reference, whereas in a world picture, man is the center. So by placing man in the center, what is interesting for me is that the center means that there can always be a beyond the center. So man is of course at the center, but there can always, in the image, there is this possibility of a beyond. And coming back so to the notion of image, what I would argue that today the notion of image is that either reduced to the one of pictures or the representation of something pre-existing, so a model or a reality. So reduced again to an imperative paradigm in which the image shows more or less precisely what the model dictates and is judged according to such a standard, or either to the notion of imaginary or imagination. So on one hand, an objective paradigm versus a subjective understanding. And in my understanding, so in my thesis, let's say, both fail to grasp this deliberative character, because one is imperative, so the objective one, and the other is a matter of interiority. So it's not communal nor political, it's just a kind of psychic fact. And what I would argue is that there is a third kind of image that does not coincide with any of those poles. So here today, I would like to briefly demonstrate this with two models. The first one, which some of you already heard me speak about, comes from French landscape architect and theoretician GIZMO. So in his inaugural lecture at the Collège de France, Clement begins with the introduction of three concepts. So it's called them three words that requires precise definition. The first concept is the one of landscape. And landscape, he says, is what lies under the expanse of our gaze. For the blind, it might be what is within the reach of all the other senses. Landscape appears to be essentially subjective because it is a transcription of a feeling, as for example in a painting. It is apprehended through a powerful filter composed of personal experience and cultural armature. These facts made landscape impossible to define universally. Thus, theoretically, for one given site, there are as many landscapes as there are individuals to interpret it. So in that sense, landscape is something eminently, we could say, sensible, so it's what lies under the expanse of our gaze. And as such, landscape is subjective. So as Clement remarks, landscape cannot be universally defined. For one given site, there are as many landscapes as there are individuals to interpret it, he says. So as something that is both sensible and subjective, landscape well illustrates the image that pertains to what I was calling as the imaginary, so a kind of private and subjective kind of image. A third quality of landscape has somehow to do with is the one of scripture writing, I would say, or better transcription. So because it can be transcribed in painting. This we will see later how it plays into the constellation. The second notion introduced by him is the one of environment. Environment, he writes, is the exact opposite of landscape in as much as it attempts to give an objective interpretation of our surroundings. It is also the shareable side of landscape. A scientific interpretation provided by tools that anyone, regardless of culture, can understand and consider in the same way. The acidity or alkalinity of the soil, the pH, is measured in the same way in Europe, Asia, or Africa, with the same tools and communicated in the same words. The sound of a site, the radioactive emission of a rock, the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the pollution rate of a river, etc., are all quantified in the same precise ways all over the planet, leading to a kind of technical Esperanto that allows a scientific reading of our environment. So if landscape on one hand is subjective, environment is the objective pole. So So is an objective interpretation of our surroundings. And furthermore, environment, as Clément describes it, is not something sensible. So the image of the environment is not produced by the senses, but by instruments of analysis. So environment, therefore, is something that can be, I would say, read or calculated. It has something to do with language and accounting. So it's something produced through what Clément calls a scientific reading. So if landscape is sensible, I would say environment is with the intelligible. Environment is closer to the other kind of image, the objective one that stands as a representation of a reality of a model. And as a reading, environment is a matter of translation. So on one hand, you have transcription, and here we have translation. So it always requires a convention, a language, what Clément calls a technical Esperanto. Instead, landscape can be transcribed even without having any particular language of convention. So on the one hand, we have landscape, which is subjective, sensible, and can be transcribed, and environment, which is objective, intelligible, and can be translated. The third concept that Clément introduced is the one of the garden. So we're back with the garden. Yeah. The garden escapes cultural divides. The garden refers only to the environment to set up an adequate rules of gardening, and it refers only to landscape insofar as it constantly creates new ones. So the garden somehow transcends this dichotomy of environment and landscape. So it is neither one nor the other, and it is therefore, I would say, autonomous from them. But autonomous in this sense doesn't mean that it is autarkic. So it entertains in its autonomy a relationship with both. It sets rules within the environment, and it engenders landscape. And by doing so, it affects both. So in it, landscape is not just anymore subjective, but it becomes an object, as it is engendered or created by the garden. At the same time, through the establishment of rules, the garden relativizes the objectivity of the environment, and it accommodates within it a rooms of subjectivity. So we have, on one hand, we have, with the garden, we have the landscape that becomes an object, and an environment where that becomes also a room for subjectivity. And so we can perhaps say that the garden is a domain for both subjective objectivity and an objective subjectivity. So there is a kind of this double articulation of which also Carla was speaking of at the beginning of yesterday. So in that sense, this garden is kind of a quantum, because it's also dealing with both transcription and translation. And for me, transcription and translation are related to resolution, which is for me related to a quickness, and then position. So the translation is also about, let's say, what is the position of the language? Let's say, are you inside or outside the language? So this double articulation is a kind of inversion of things that the garden operates, and is quite consistent with constitutes the garden in itself, so the plants. And in this book, so here I'm quoting the book of Life of Plants from Emanuele Coccia, that writes that plants challenge one of the pillars of the biological and natural sciences of the past few centuries: the priority of the environment over the living, of the world over life, of space over the subject. Plants, he writes, demonstrate that living beings produce the space in which they live rather than being forced to adapt to it. So somehow it's not a matter of adapting to a reality, but of casting it. They demonstrate that life is a rupture in the asymmetry between container and contained. When there is life, the container is located in the contained and is thus contained by it, and vice versa. So this inversion is similar to the one operated by the garden, in which the environment or the objective becomes subject to rules. A landscape or the subjective becomes engendered as an object. Both plants and garden in this sense suspend that imperative paradigm according to which it is the environment or the reality to dictate the rules according to which the subject has to adapt, and allows for a communication between, so the garden allows for a communication between the two words that does not need to follow this paradigm. So the one is subject of the object. And on this line of thought, here we come to the icon of the connection. So on this line of thought of the connection between these two words, so the objective, the subjective, the one of the, if you want, the reality and the imaginary, which is private and public, I would like to introduce The second model that I would like to discuss, so the one of the icon, and specifically as discussed by Russian theologian Pavel Florensky in a book called Iconostasis. So Florensky in his book describes the religious icon as a border, of course, between the visible and invisible and between the mundane and the divine. But such a border, the important thing, is not something traced once and for all and removable, but it is one endowed with a certain kind of, I would say, mechanics, or it is a kind of architectonic border. Florensky explains the mechanics of the icon in analogies with one of a peculiar kind of dreams. So the ones that he says are induced by some external cause. So the ones dreams that are in which, for instance, a noise or some other external stimulus forces the dream and the sleep to conclusion. For example, he writes, I dream that a pistol shot goes off, and in the room near me, someone is really shot, or somebody has slammed the door. Or I dream that someone falls upon me and begins to strangle me, and I awake in terror to find that a pillow has fallen on my chest. Or I dream that I am attacked by a dog, and I awake to find that a mosquito has bitten me. So in this setup, Florensky identifies this external stimulus. So for instance, the slammed door or the mosquito bite. So the one that belonging to a daytime consciousness with omega, and the event inside of the dream with X. The event X inside the dream is therefore an image of the stimulus omega outside of it. Such an image merges, according to Florensky, two different temporalities. So both of them seem to move apparently from one event to the other, so from cause to effect. And even in the dream X, which is the final event, seems the effect and the conclusion of a series of events. So it seems a conclusion of events. So A was the original event, led to R, to S, to T, to X, which is the concluding event of the dream. The fact is that as an image of omega, X is instead the point from which all the other events spring. So an effect from which all its own causes are engendered. So it's actually the opposite. So we have therefore two kinds of temporalities, the real time of daylight consciousness, that's so to say, and what Florensky calls an inverted time, or a time that flows backward. Because all the events that precede the event X, and that seems in the dream to be the cause of it, are instead retroactively justified by it, since in the light of the awake consciousness, it is the final event that caused the entire dream to unfold. Did you kind of get how the scheme works? Okay. The temporality of the dream is nonetheless not just going backwards. So it's not just about mirroring, but it's also instantaneous. So in the dream, Florensky notes the time runs at an accelerated speed, because the whole cascade of events that happened in the dream time cannot be dreamt but instantaneously. So at the infinite speed of the instant of the external stimulus omega that causes and at the same time put an end to the dream, which became like it happened at the same time of the stimulus. So he says time in the dream runs and accelerated it runs towards the actual and against the movement of time in waking consciousness. Dream time is turned inside out, which means all its concrete images are also turned inside out with it. And that means we have entered the domain of imaginary space. Of course, this imaginary is not just anymore a kind of private imaginary, but it's something which is is extend beyond the privacy of the subject. And we found here once again, that this is not that the imaginary is not like just private, but it has its own physics, and most importantly, it communicates through the image, which is in this case the icon, with the real. And not only real and imaginary communicate with each other, but they are convertible with each other. So it says that the very same event is perceived from the area of actual space as the actual is seen the very same event that is perceived from the area of actual space as actual is seen from the area of imaginary space as imaginary. So to understand such convertibility, we could perhaps, this I'm not sure, but I just placed with you this analogy. So we could think of the imaginary, the inverted instantaneous time of night and consciousness as light, and of the real time of daylight of consciousness as matter. So once we start, or it's gravity. So once we start to move at the speed of light, light turns into matter and matter turns into light. And this convertibility and communication is what the icon or the iconostasis ensures. So the icon as an image is what makes this convertibility, or with this passage, this communication possible. So contrarily, he writes, the goal seen from here appears as something cherished but lacking the energy of the ideal. But since from there, through the other consciousness, the goal is comprehended as living energy that shapes actuality and its creative form. So death becomes life and life becomes death somehow. Seen through the paradigm of iconostasis, imaginary space is in this sense what I would call a projectual space in an architectonic sense. So as indeed the goals and not the causes are what shaped actuality, so precisely like in an architectural project, representation, let's say, precedes actuality and not vice versa. And the icon is precisely this boundary and the connection that turns this living energy into an actual environment, precisely like the life of plants described by Kocha. So something able to shape its own environment and to question its character of necessity, so it's imperative again paradigm. So something that is able to do so by rupturing the asymmetry of things, subject and object in the case of the garden, container containing the one of plants, and we would say mundane and divine in the case of the icon. So here I move towards the conclusion. We have garden and icon. So what does this have to do with architecture, and how can we understand them as model to rethink images within the digital, as I kind of claim in my title? So first of all, garden and icon are models of an image that is neither following an imperative paradigm, so it is not dictated, nor is completely arbitrary. This is not merely scientific, nor merely artistic, we could say. And yet, in its connection, is in connection with both. So in that sense, it's architectonic. But it is architectonic precisely because by transcending both these poles, it articulates them. So this third image is therefore truly deliberative, I would say. And as Aristotle once wrote that the deliberative intelligence is architectonic intelligence. This deliberative quality is achieved through a compenetration between different domains that are apparently incompatible. So subject and object, public and private, sensitive and intelligent, mundane and divine, natural and artificial, and we can keep on going. And perhaps this, I don't know, will be my kind of proposal / question here. It will be interesting to think about terms such as virtual reality, artificial intelligence, augmented reality, game engine, etc. So the terms that are somehow the keywords of this concern, precisely as gardens or as icons. So, for instance, as images in which the domain of the objective, so artificial objects, machines, reality engines, is endowed with a certain subjectivity, so intelligence, learning, virtual playfulness. So something that goes beyond a mere logic comprehension, so to say. And in particular regard to the digital and the icon, or to the iconostasis, it would be perhaps interesting to think of the digital image as a compenetration, so a confluence and an articulation of two temporalities, so between a time of necessity and of gravity and a fertile time full of grace, so to say, and also to kind of quote the icon here. So think of the digital as what Roberto Calasso calls the confluence between digital and digitable. So images are not just digital, but digitable. So they contract two different temporalities, a closed one and an open one. And the confluence of the digital, of the digitable, it can also be analogous to the coincidence of what we have in the garden, which is a coincidence of design and construction. So which is somehow, I think, could also be something which was linked to Daniela's talk. So here I'm quoting Editorial and Maria Giurici, that in their concise history of gardens write that the making of a garden blurs the traditional distinction between design and construction. So design and construction compenetrate in the garden like divine and mundane in the icon, and digital in the image. So and this, let's say, to conclude, as I would propose to read the title of the conference, or Playing Models. Not that, and the playfulness here is not something alternative to something serious or responsible. So like could be fiction or virtuality that is not reality, but the playfulness of models here, or rather, in my case of the image, as something immanent to the seriousness of things, as a something, so as a deliberative dimension, and as such, not only as something that calls, and as such, not only calls for ethical and political responsibility, but as something that makes room for them. Thank you.